Okay, lecture 3, and we are continuing on the topic that we began last week. And as you remember, we're looking at verbal art and looking specifically for a theoretical background at the work of Professor Ruqayyah Hasan. And I will review some of those points that were made last week in this first hour. And we will continue to look at the poetry of the Singaporean poet Edwin Tumbu. And hopefully today we will also get to looking at Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. All right, so let's review a bit of what we discussed last week. We are looking at the idea of verbal art, and verbal art, of course, includes poetry, drama, novels, any particular kind of what we might call literature. And as I mentioned, the work that influenced my approach to the study of verbal art came from this professor, Professor Ruqayyah Hasan, who also happens to be the wife of Professor M.A.K. Halliday. And of course, they share a similar approach to language. And as I pointed out, Professor Halliday focused primarily on verbal science, the language of science, the way of speaking in science and academic discourse. Whereas Professor Hasan has focused on verbal art. Specifically this book, and if you are interested in following up, I strongly would recommend this particular book, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art. Now you remember her point, and the idea was that there's more than one level of meaning, more than one meaning that comes across in what we're saying. Normally, when we're talking or listening, reading, whatever, what we are paying attention to is what we would call the verbalization. It includes the meaning, the grammar, phonology, exactly what you're hearing from me right now. That's the verbalization. That's language, and the meaning you're taking away from this is what I'm telling you and explaining to you about verbal art. But as we said, there is another level of meaning, a second order of meaning, deeper level of meaning. This is achieved through symbolic articulation. Now, look at those two words, symbolic, symbols, metaphors. Articulation is when you speak something out, right? You articulate it. So what you are doing is you are articulating the metaphor, the symbolic meaning, the deeper meaning. Now, how you achieve this is through something she calls foregrounding. You only can really foreground something against a background. So when you talk about foregrounding, it assumes a background of that which is sort of frequent. It is what is the pattern that you're looking at. In this sense, of the picture here, the trees themselves, it's repeated, this pattern of tree after tree after tree, and all in green. So then what stands out is something that doesn't belong to that pattern. And that's that waterfall, which is foregrounded, it's highlighted. Professor David Butt, as I mentioned, refers to this as mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice. Taking control of the way we normally use language and turning it into a non-habitual consistency. In other words, that's how you create the background. You take the way that we use language and you make it so consistent that it becomes a pattern. So you're mobile. How does the background get achieved in language? Mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, the ways we use language, taking that and then turning it into a pattern through a non-habitual, not common, not normal, not the default kind of consistency. You're repeating something. And why do you do all this? You do this in order to achieve that deeper meaning, which is the theme. Now, when we talk about theme, this point I think is really important that Hassan makes. It's not what initially engages you when you read it. Now later we're going to look at that movie, Murder on the Orient Express. And when you look at the Murder on the Orient Express, the film, it's entertainment. It's a well-known investigator, Hercule Poirot, comes along and solves this murder. That's what you initially think the movie is about. But what we're going to see is that, in fact, there is a way in which language is being used in order to convey a message with respect to what is justice. And how do you answer the question, is it wrong to murder a murderer? That's basically what will come out of it. So the theme is something that is symbolically articulated. It is achieved through metaphor. And what we mean by metaphor is when you take the usual aspects of language that we are normally using to speak and turning them into a non-habitual, it is not normal, not the usual kind of consistency. Theme is what's going to stay. Hassan is saying that what's this deeper meaning, and this is why it's art, all right? This is what makes it art, not just use of language. It's what's going to stay, this theme is what's going to stay in the reader's consciousness, as she puts it, long after the pleasure of encountering the artistic turn of phrases has dissipated itself. It's the message that you're going to be remembering. Now, as I said last week, very often those in literature sort of look down on the way linguists approach literature. And in some respects, that may be a reputation that's been earned by the fact that some have just sort of been preoccupied with trying to quantify the features that appear in language, or point out certain features which aren't grammatical and say that that's style. A far too perhaps simplistic approach to looking at literature and art, and as though that's what it can be quantified. No one is saying that. It can't be quantified. We can certainly look for those patterns, yes, but there's something more to it. So Lance St. John Butler had this to say: Hassan's work is a good first step towards the sort of liberation we need. She is aware that a linguistic analysis of a text, and this is very often in linguistics called stylistics. A linguistic analysis of a text, stylistics in action, is a vast undertaking. Even as simple a sentence as Robert Frost's "I wonder about the trees" needs exhaustive analysis at the levels of semantics, syntax, lexicon, phonology. And she imagines the innumerable tables listing frequencies of tokens of different types from the various levels of language. But she rejects this method, and she objects that without any hypothesis, one can do very little with such tables. How could one form an interpretation from them? Straight linguistic analysis can say nothing about the text as art. It just cannot be just a straight linguistic analysis. There has to be a hypothesis. And what is this hypothesis? This hypothesis is as she puts it, about some aspect of the life of social man. For the poet, for the dramatist, for the novelist, what is it that they are saying? And they have a hypothesis about the life of social man. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a hypothesis about what that hypothesis is. They come up with sort of a theory. They come up with a way of looking at the world. And we are trying to discover what that particular hypothesis is. We are trying to interpret out of that piece of art, verbal art, what is meant. And then, because you see, in the approach that we're taking, we begin with a function, we begin with a meaning, you begin with a hypothesis, and then you look at how that gets across in the grammar. This is fundamental to the approach of systemic functional linguistics, to the approach of Halliday and Hassan and so on. You begin with the function, that has priority. You begin with the meaning, and in this case, you're beginning with the hypothesis that you believe that author, that writer, that director had in mind and was wanting to express. The patterns of language are so deployed as to take us in a particular direction. You see, and I'll mention just a few of the examples we talked about last time, which illustrate this. Each message is a message by itself, but the totality of these messages enunciates a theme. How does the theme become accessible? By examining the meaning of these individual messages. How each of the sort of clauses that make up the text itself, and the kinds of patterns that emerge when we look at the totality of these messages, and look at the patterns that emerge, the background, and then the repatterning of those patterns, where the author chooses to foreground and deviate from that pattern, and what is produced is an extended metaphor. And we looked at Cross the Road Not Taken. And you remember the hypothesis that Hassan began with. Cross the Road Not Taken, read with an understanding of its deepest message, will leave an impression of the theme. So what did she take away from that? What was the hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man? The immutability of human choice. And those choices made lightly because through the thick curtain of the present, it appeared less than momentous. We're making choices all the time. And some of them appear quite normal, quite common, not momentous, certainly. The realization, though, comes too late that the lightly made choice has made all the difference. And how did she approach this? She approached it in quite a unique way, because what she did was she looked at the kinds of, we call them processes. Many would call them verbs. And she noticed that we can sort of distinguish them along a continuum, a climb, going from dynamic to non-dynamic. And dynamic being an actor that does something to someone else, something else, is perhaps more dynamic than just saying something without there even being someone to whom you are addressing what you're saying. And more dynamic than just what we perhaps think and what we're sensing, what we're feeling, what we're contemplating. And finally, carrier. Perhaps now these were all examples from the poem. What does a carrier mean? What is, and the attribute, the idea being that the carrier has an attribute. And the example, like Tom is smart, all right? Tom is smart. So Tom is the carrier and he has an attribute. Now that's not dynamic. It is a property, it is a quality that exists. This is what she is proposing. And she's looking at it then within the context of the poem and looking at it in terms of who's doing what. And what she found was, for example, the protagonist that is there, that is faced with this choice of which road to choose. The only dynamic action that he makes is taking which road. Now that foregrounds it. It foregrounded of all that's going on, of all that's happening in this poem, what's being foregrounded, what's being sort of, with respect to the protagonist, the only dynamic action is making that choice. The roads have no effect. They simply are. They exist. So what she says then is that the universe that is being set up by this poem is one in which the dynamic role does not appear to be assigned either the I of the poem or the roads. Both appear equally incapable of affecting the world around them. The only action is, for I, is the choice that's being made. The actions that are, and what's really interesting from this poem, as I pointed out, and that is that the actions, the road being well-traveled, all is anonymous. The actors, those that trod that road, we don't know anything about them. In fact, there isn't even a verb. It's, though, as for the passing. We turned the verb into a noun. It didn't end up even being a happening. It turned out to be a something, the passing, without any attributing it to any particular actors, agents. No step had trodden black. Again, not stepping, no step. It turns it into a noun. Turn the verbs into nouns. And to do what? So that nothing then needs to be mentioned about who did what. The environment is influenced, we said, by anonymous, faceless beings. The only effectual thing is the anonymous, timeless passing, the steps. We saw that it wasn't just in terms of the choices that are being made by the poet Frost in what verbs are used and so forth, but it's also, we said, illustrated by logical meaning. We've talked about parataxis and hypotaxis. I'm not going to repeat that. But we notice that the poem is really divided quite evenly into two halves, and just as there are two roads. The first part seems to be divided into three. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. Next, and sorry I could not travel both. And a third part on the first half. And on the second half, and this is punctuated as in this way, we again have three parts. And so it's quite symmetrical, it's quite balanced. It's as though they are equal, the two halves of the poem. It coincides with the idea that there are two roads, with not much to distinguish them. There's a parallelism too here in the sense that how it began, two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And that's how it ends, two roads diverged in a yellow wood. The second part of that first half then took the other, and that's repeated again at the end of the poem. I took the one less traveled by. And what's left over then? And that has made all the difference. Summing up, two alternatives presented themselves, no choice but to choose, no real basis for the choice. The choice taken blocked out the other choice, and the consequence is everlasting. What is achieved is a literary artifact, an extended metaphor. We also looked at another analysis of hers, and that was of the widower in the country. And again, we're looking at it from the standpoint of who's doing what. We're looking at who are in the ER roles of the various processes that are mentioned in this poem. Who are the affected? And here, yes, we're quantifying it. We're looking at in terms of the widower stands out as the background. It's repeated. Anything else mentioned in the poem as far as having some role, whether it's doing or sensing or behaving or whatever, anything other than the widower, you could say, is foregrounded. The process types. Doing was obviously the what was done most frequently. It was the background. Anything other than doing then, any other process type, foregrounded. Logical relations. Now, as I mentioned last week, there are a number of different features that we looked at. We looked at the process type, doing. Who is the doer? The widower. We looked at the fact that you have some sentences where you have so much going on, parataxis, hypotaxis, embedding. But you have, for the most part throughout the poem, a simple conjunction, and this, he did this, and then this, and then this. That's repeated, that's the background. And so foregrounded is the use of other conjunctions. Tense. Most of it is in future tense. I'll do this, I'll do that. In certain places, other tenses are foregrounded. The point being that these various patterns that emerge, they all consistently seem to appear together in certain locations. And that is really the idea, looking for these where there is this sort of foregrounding and noticing a consistent foregrounding of various aspects of language occurring in particular places within the poem. In other words, what the poet is doing, the poet is drawing your attention to those specific locations, highlighting here the aching, the darkness, the screaming. Mobilizing the patterns of habitual choice, the way we use language. Taking the future, for example, future tense, repeating it so much. Repeating the use of and, taking features, things that we do with language, but repeating them with a non-habitual consistency until they become the background. And against then that background, the poet chooses to deviate from that pattern and foreground. We began to look at the poetry of Edwin Tumbu, and we're going to continue to be looking at his poetry today. And as I mentioned, Edwin Tumbu is the father of English language poetry in Singapore. He's a well-known English language poet. He was invited, the School of Creative Media invited him to be part of this presentation that it was called Edwin Tumbu Natterson, The Infinite Line. And it was presented in Hong Kong and also in Shanghai. I mentioned also, and I just want you to, again, have that background. Remember that Edwin Tumbu, in Singapore, you have the Merlion, you have at the base of the Merlion, you have a plaque, and on that plaque is one of his poems, Ulysses by the Merlion. I know Edwin Tumbu. As I mentioned, I taught in Singapore back in the 80s before I came to Hong Kong. And Edwin Tumbu was the dean of the faculty, the head of the department. And at that time, the Department of English Language and Literature was largely literature. And he was wanting to add linguistics to the program there. He's always had a fascination with language. He says this, I'm looking at language as part of my life, trying to create, to make my poems, putting language together. He's very, very mindful of his use of language. He's an artist. An artist when it comes to language. And an artist knows what are his resources by which he can create, by which he can produce a particular meaning, a deeper meaning. Technique, he says, is all about poetry in the making, chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, how tight it is, the layering. Now that's sort of what I'm wanting to discover then in his poetry. Now, as I mentioned, the first poem that I looked at to begin with, after having read Ruqayya Hassan's book and what she had written about verbal art, I became quite interested in looking at whether I could also sort of discover something of what was going on in a particular poem. And given Edwin Tumbu's interest in language itself, I decided to take one of his poems and analyze it. And that poem was, the first poem I analyzed was Gods Can Die. Now, I'm not going to repeat the poem. We looked at this poem last week. You remember, though, from that poem that there was sort of a symmetry, there was sort of duality that seemed to be at play there in that poem. There were a lot of pairs, and there was a lot of comparing items of equal status. Lexically, this is very obvious, and we looked at these examples: major versus minor, private versus public, generous versus mean, gain versus lose, live versus die, hint versus state. He paired a lot of things, and some of them were contrasting pairs, opposites. And so what emerged then was sort of a sense of duality, truth and falsehood, good and evil, life and death. So this pattern emerged throughout the poem of comparing things. And so there were examples of apposition that were repeated. Apposition is where you put two nouns together, they refer to the same thing. Opposition, opposites. You had addition, negation, alternation. Highly paratactic. Now, for example, there were powerful men, we said, undo themselves. Good men bind themselves. Notice the opposites here. Undo, bind. The relaxed spirit of our evenings contrasted with these days of power. All right, so that is what he's creating as far as the background. Everything is symmetrical. Everything is paratactic. And against this background of symmetry and duality, you have this sort of curious statement: gods can die. Elaborating on that title, Tumbu explained that gods refers to humanistic impulses, the goodness in man. Can that goodness die? He says this, I believe that ultimately man makes and unmakes his destiny depending on which side of him prevails. Well, the friend that he was referring to in this poem was one who he felt had lost that sense of goodness. In seeking after power, a side of him prevailed, which was not a good side. What struck me again, I'll just mention this because I want to have this background in leading into the coming poems, because I want to sort of trace with you the way I've been looking at Edwin Tumbu's poetry. I began with Gods Can Die, and I'm noticing pairs, things in pairs, all right, things in twos. And so I have seen powerful men. What about powerful men? They undo themselves, keep two realities, two things. What are the two realities? One for minor friends, one for the powers that be. Who are the powers that be? The really powerful. That is apposition, okay? All right, so you noticed a layer upon layer upon layer of pairs, things paired together. Again, it continued, we said, such people take a role, such people accept essential part in some minor project. Again, paratactic, we're still on that same pattern. But then he breaks it. Because then it's not paratactic anymore. After a bit of duty that makes them fester with intentions, that whole part, after a bit of duty, is hypotactically joined with the main clause. They play the major figure to old friends. Now it's hypotactic. You have a dependent clause and a main clause. The symmetry is broken. It's asymmetrical. And where it is asymmetrical, you notice that it sort of highlights what that friend had become. They play the major figure to old friends. A bit of duty that makes them fester and like sore, like an infection. So the negativity, this negative side to this friend, comes through in the hypotaxis. Again, that layering continues. We understand and try to seek a balance in the dark, to know the private from the public monument. And you can read down, you can see the highlighting that I've given here. You can see you layer upon layer upon layer of parataxis. Then we have the next part, the casual word, the easiness, the quick, straight answer, the humane delay, the lack of cautiousness, listing things. Again, they're all equal. They're all part of this series of things that are being mentioned. And then it is broken, again, with hypotaxis, where what is mentioned is this friend's unresponsiveness, unwillingness to talk, unwillingness to engage. I believe, Tumbu said, that ultimately man makes and unmakes his destiny depending on which side of him prevails. Which side? There are two sides. And that comes through in this extended metaphor of that is played out through language, through the use of parataxis, symmetry in language, which is then against that background is foregrounded. What happened to this friend and how this friend was no longer the good side that was prevailing. His getting into politics and power, it was another side that Tumbu saw. Now, where we left off is with this poem, Tumbu's David. Now, David is it's based on a Bible story, in fact. What's interesting about this poem is that you'll notice it was written for me. He wrote the poem, he dedicated it to me. And this was after I had left Singapore and I now was in Hong Kong. And I had analyzed his poem, Gods Can Die, and I had published it and he had seen it. And then he sent me this poem, David. And I read the poem. And I'll have, you'll hear him read the poem. Just a bit of background to it. It's, as I mentioned, it's an Old Testament Bible story about King David before he became a king. And in this story, one thing I should mention to you is that there was another king at the time. His name was King Saul. And King Saul lost favor with God through his disobedience. And God asked his prophet Samuel to anoint a successor to Saul. Well, the one anointed to be Saul's successor was, in fact, David. Now, when the word got out, David was anointed. And in fact, David was Saul's son-in-law. David was married to Saul's daughter. When the word got out that David was the one who had been anointed to succeed Saul, well, Saul hated David. Saul wanted to kill David. And David had to flee for his life. He had to flee for his life and go into exile. And he had a group, a band that were of other warriors that were with him. And they were basically in exile in this wilderness. And Saul and his army were chasing them all around, trying to capture and kill David. Remove this one who had been anointed to be his successor. Now, in this story that comes from the Bible, that Tumbu's turned into a poem, David and one of his band it's nighttime, and Saul's army is camped there, and David and the one who's with him have snuck into the camp. And David intends to let Saul know that he was there. But the one who is with him, David and Abishai. Abishai was the one who was with David. And Abishai, you have the chance. Saul is asleep there. We've snuck into the camp. The spear, Saul's spear is by his side. Take that spear and kill him. Kill Saul. And David refuses to do so. All he does is he leaves something to mark the fact that he had been there. He doesn't kill Saul. And in fact, this is recorded, this story, 2 accounts of this taking place. Saul is there, he's encamped, and it's nighttime and he's asleep. And David is able to sneak into the camp and with God's protection, and demonstrate to Saul that David has the chance to kill him, but is not willing to do so. David is not desiring to kill him in order to succeed him. Well, now that's the story, okay? Now, honestly, curiously, I'm asking myself, why, of all the Bible stories that there are, and there are some really nice ones, why this one? Why write a poem about this particular story? And then also dedicate it to me. What's the message to be taken away from this particular story from the Bible put into poetry? Okay, So my goal is to discover what was Tumbu's intention. Why this story? Why this poem?
David 2 for Jonathan Webster. With shepherd stealth astutely tempered by the blunt history of his pain, David and volunteer Abisai sought and found, for the second terrible time, their king asleep. Saul's dedicated jealous anger still fermented, still heaved and proud, but David's deeply rooted faith chose to see the Lord's anointed. Not the royal discontent, the turbulent hunter of his life, who gave without intent point and precision to his hardy band, to their fugitive wanderings among hill and cave and longish and Gedian nights. Thus delivered, Saul lay fragile, exhausted, sealed in quiet, his spear neatly pushed into the ground by his bolster. Saul, the grievous, grey flawed instrument, restless victim of disobedience, rampaging willfulness, who so needed music, loved courage, monumental anger, adrenaline for tribal nation, who was moved by majesty, pride, quick remorse, who remembered the quarrelsome word of Samuel, that thorn, that nuisance of a judge turned prophet. Let me smite him, I pray thee, the Lord himself will strike. And they left, taking the mighty spear, whose sharp whistle had shaved the air before, just missing him as he sat, composing psalms. And the cruiser of water, life, leaving the camp, the chance to cure so simply their exile in the uncertain bitter south, they walked between trenches of enemies, divinely tranquilized. So ensued some necessary prophecies to fill their days, sparing some metaphors for us. And they get them away, and no man saw it. Darting nimbly as they climbed, held their breath, checked the drift of stars, the needling angle of the wind, as it shifted across gullies, pushing patches of mist up the slopes. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts, kept from discovery certain death by the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. They gained the distant high space of a neighboring hill, where sad David called down to Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave, "Ye are worthy to die, ye have not kept your master." Heard and spoke to Saul, and then departed.
Okay, now, before I go into talking about the poem itself and looking at the analysis, I'm going to stop here for a minute, and we'll take a break. And according to my phone, it is about 1:45, and can we begin at 5 minutes to the hour? All right, so a 10-minute break at this point, and I'll see you in 10 minutes time. Okay, everyone, let's begin again, and do let me know if there's a problem with the what you're seeing or what you're hearing, and we'll find out if it's something on my end or your end. In the meantime, during the break, that's what I've been trying to do, to try and see if I can make sure that the videos aren't blurring, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so let's carry on. So we're looking at this poem, David, and I'm coming after I've analyzed Gods Can Die, and So I've noticed the use of parataxis and hypotaxis. All right. So so I'm looking sort of to see if that's going to emerge here in this poem as well. Is that the technique that that Tambu's going to be bringing to this? My purpose here, remember, is I'm analyzing it. I'm looking for patterns that might give me some clue as to the metaphor that the artist is trying to articulate, the symbolic articulation. So let's just take it from the beginning. And what I've noticed is with Shepherd's stealth, astutely tempered by the blunt history of his pain, a lot of embedding there, all right? And that's all sort of pre-modifying David. That's why I've indicated here with the pre-modification is the beta, and David is the main who's being modified, all right, with the shepherd's stealth, sturdily tempered by the blunt history of his pain. And all of that is sort of talking about David. Now, there's two people here, though. And so and so there's parataxis, and David and volunteer Abishai. There's a pair, David and volunteer Abishai. Then there's another pair, sought and found. And that second pair, unlike the first pair, where you have David, who's pre-modified by all this embedding and so forth, and now here you have found, the second verb in that second pair, sought and found, is also sort of post-modified for the second terrible time. Oh, it looked rather, mirror image, all right? You have two pairs, and the first item of the first pair is pre-modified, and the second item of the second pair is post-modified. All right, so I'm looking for anything that I see can be sort of patterns. Okay, let's continue. I noticed something that happened quite frequently throughout the poem, though. For example, anger. Saul's dedicated, jealous anger. Well, there's three things that are sort of pre-modifying anger. Saul's, possessive, dedicated, sort of a past participle, and jealous, adjective. So we have Saul's, dedicated, jealous. And you have two that are sort of adjectival, dedicated and jealous. And you have one that's possessive, all right, in this triplet. So you have two that are rather alike, and you have one that's different. You have that possessive form, Saul's. Now, I have noticed a triplet here, and I find the next triplet in the next line. I have still fermented, still heaved. Well, okay, again, those are both quite alike. And prowled, verb, all right, just by itself. Still fermented, still heaved, and prowled. So what I begin to see in this poem are, well, things in threes. Remember, gods can die were things in twos, pairs. Well, here I see triplets. And in those triplets, I notice that two are typically alike and stand out from the third item in that triplet. So we have Saul's, the possessive, dedicated, jealous, two adjectives. Still fermented, still heaved. All right, so repeating the same still. And then the third is prowled. Almost triangular. And it's sort of, you might say they're almost like overlaying, all right, one another. Now, when you do that, when you take those sort of triangular shapes and you put them over one another, what you end up with is what? Well, you end up with a symbol, visual symbol, in fact, the Star of David. Now, that's not the only occurrence, okay? It's repeated throughout the poem. But David's deeply rooted faith chose to see the Lord's anointed not the royal discontent, and not the turbulent hunter of his life. Among hill and cave, two locations, hill and cave, and then a time reference, longish Ian nights. So I throughout the poem, I notice these triplets, two that are alike and one that's different. Well, let's carry on. When Saul is being described, notice that he is grievous, great. You have alliteration here. And then that third, flawed instrument. Needed music, loved courage. Again, the two are alike. Monumental anger. The third is different. Majesty, pride, two nouns. Quick remorse. And you notice that the third item in all of these, flawed instrument, monumental anger, quick remorse, there's sort of another triplet that emerges there. And so there are obviously he's playing with this idea of triplets, and very often two of them are alike in some respect and somehow different than the third one, third item of the triplet. Well, you even have three sort of main characters. You have David, you have Saul, you have the Lord God. And each of them has sort of their sidekick. David has his Abishai. Saul, his guard, Abner. The Lord, his prophet, Samuel. Again, playing on this idea of things in threes. Now, here's a very interesting example. At the beginning of this, okay, let me smite him, I pray thee, and the Lord himself will strike. And they left, taking the mighty spear, whose sharp whistle had shaved the air before, just missing him as he sat composing psalms. And the cruse of water life. Now notice that, and the cruse of water life. Simple, a simple pair there. Now that's in stark contrast to, for example, the complexity that occurred before it. Now notice, though, there's a pattern even in that. They left, past tense, taking, verb ing, whose sharp whistle had shaved, past tense, just missing, verb ing. As he sat, past tense, composing, verb ing. 1, 2, 3. Now you notice that, again, it's this idea of things in threes. But then suddenly you have that pair. So what has he done here? He's created a pattern. He's taking the way we just use language, but he's repeating that pattern in a quite inconsistent way because it is so past tense ing, like that, you see? And the cruse of water life. And that then is foregrounded. The cruse of water life, the simple pair. You see, what had been the background of God's Kendai, the pairing, now becomes the foreground in this poem. Foregrounded against a complexity of things in threes. There's another pair here. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts. Again, a simple parataxis. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts. Before it, there is this, again, complex sentence crossing several lines that, again, has a pattern. You have darting. It begins with an ing. It ends with an ing. And then you have another pair within it, held, past tense, checked, another. And then the drift of stars, the needling angle of the wind. In a way, it's quite astonishing the way the poet is creating a particular pattern, things in threes. And against that pattern, things that occur as a pair. The cruise of water, life. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts. You have a certain, even the triplets have a certain kind of symmetry to them, almost a mirror image. How it begins is how it ends, darting, pushing. And then within it, two pairs, held, checked, the drift of stars, the needling ankle of the wind. And after that pair, pain and joy rippled in their hearts, you have another very, again, complex, grammatically phrasing. And within it, though, you begin, kept from discovery, certain death, you have an apposition, and it ends with an apposition. Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave. Now, there is this idea of there is a symmetry here, even in the hypotaxis. You have that kept from discovery, certain death by the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. And then you have the main clause, they gained the distant. And again, that's followed by a very complex post-modification. And that paratactic apposition occurs at the beginning of the pre-modification and at the end of the post-modification. So what stands out? The cruise of water, life, the pair. It's foregrounded. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts. But there's something else happening here. Remember, David is credited with writing not all of the Psalms, but many of the Psalms that occur in the Bible. You know, there's that one book of the Bible, it's called Psalms, and Psalms are songs. Songs are poetry. But there's a particular technique in Hebrew poetry. And we can see sort of an example of it here. Kept from discovery. And you have later kept. It almost seems to cross over, almost seems to form like an X if you draw the lines. That technique is called chiasm. And it's named after the Greek letter chi. It's a mirroring of structures. And we see it in the Psalms. Take this psalm, for example. It begins, the heavens declare the glory of God. Okay, what is the heavens? You can see it sort of pictured there, all right? The heavens, that's what you see at nighttime, all right? The stars. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. What do you see in the skies? You see all right, you don't see the stars, you see the blue sky, all right? That's what you see at daytime. You see the sky at daytime. You see the heavens at night. But then notice in the next verse, day after day, it matches with the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. Matches with the heavens. This is a well-known sort of structuring. It's a chiastic structure. Forms like an X. And Tumbu basically is doing the same thing in his poem as well. All right, so how does there's this two lines in the poem. And when I saw those two lines, I knew that Edwin was saying something to me through this poem. So ensued some necessary prophecies to fill their days, some metaphors for us. So what were the metaphors for me? Against I see all these triplets, I see these pairs, right? You see there is a technique. You see there's obviously the poet is doing something with the language. It even ends on that way, right? Heard and spoke to Saul and then departed. Heard and spoke, related to the way we converse departed. Again, another one of those triplets, two alike, one different. Remember when I was mentioning to you, I was pointing out that before I go on to the next one, what was the message that I took away from this? Well, you remember earlier on, I mentioned a particular, I'm just going to go back to that slide to illustrate the point that I think the poet was making. Remember I said when you take those triplets and the way they're sort of the mirror image of each other, and then you sort of juxtapose them and you see sort of this Star of David, iconic symbol, the Jewish people. Now, legend has it that this particular symbolic shape, Star of David, was the shape of the shield that he used to protect himself. The shield was in this shape. That's what legend has to say. And so what does that sort of represent? If that's sort of the shape of his shield, what is the shield? The shield is protection, right? David goes into this camp, and one of the main points about the story is that God protected him. God made the soldiers in that camp, not just Saul, but the other soldiers protecting him, fall asleep in order to protect David, so that David could sneak in and take something that would tell Saul later, I was there, I could have killed you, but I didn't. But the point was, God protected David. You see, what was the point of the poem? For me, what I took away, the metaphor that I took away from this was, yes, there's life, cruise of water, life, and pain and joy in this life. But you are protected. You see, what I took away from the poem is that it was a blessing. In this life, yes, there's pain and joy, but you are protected. God is protecting you. You're shielded. That was the message that I took away from that poem. Of course, when one does that analysis and one comes up with this theory, all right, one would like to know from the poet, is that the message? Is that what you intended? And I asked Edwin when he visited me, because he was a visitor to Singapore, to Hong Kong several times. He visited our university, he visited other universities. And I asked him, I said, is that my analysis? Did I get what it was that you were doing? And he responded, some of it. Some of it. Some necessary prophecies to fill their days. Some metaphors for us. Well, I got some of the metaphors and some of what he was doing in that particular poem. I guess that means there was more to that poem than what I even saw. But that's the craft behind the art, you see. That's what makes it more than just the verbalization, more than just the Bible story being retold as a poem. There was something else there. That's what makes it art. And what the poet is drawing on is what he mentions before, the tautness, tightly, the layering. See, the poet is drawing on the resources of language in order to be able to say something. And we probably don't get all of it. But even if we get some of it, I'm happy with that. All right, now that was David. Okay, and let's go on to the next poem. This poem is entitled A Poet Reading. Now later, okay, I've analyzed Gods Can Die, and I've analyzed David. And then Tambu sent me a letter. And with the letter was a poem. And on the poem, he had written a little note. Analyze this. Analyze this. Well, what can I do but analyze the poem, right? A poet reading. Now, to begin with, I'm asking myself, why is it a poet reading? Why isn't it a poet writing? Okay? Isn't that what the poet does? There's obviously something else there, right? Well, so let's hear the poem, and I hope that you're all able to get it and so forth. So let's hear it.
A Poet Reading 1. She is sunlight, standing by the pool, in a garden we laced with flowers and songs, as we walked into ourselves, enshrined within a tactile moment, with no beginning, with no end, a brow lifted gently by rising lotuses receives the sky's deep reverence. As her eyes watch 7 golden koi swim serenely into provinces of silence. Then, on the left side, where the heart resides, a hand lifts reluctantly, as if compelled by lingering strands of bitter ancient winds, now sadly come together, taking her in ways that only harsh things can. There is always darkness to elide, after which she is again sunlight waiting to be poems. 2. She is someone we all know, especially those whose names are written in water, who scour big and small infinities, who are at times blessed by paths that absolve the failure of their lines, when, pilgriming, they find a star's immaculate art that returns us to this image, trysting yet again. Then lexicon and grammar and naming stir, bringing metaphor, metonymy, synopsis, plus assorted relatives to achieve a feverish making. That is never done, for our words don't take in all. A cup always slips, shatters into lamentations at imagination's door. The perfect poem is future tense. Meanwhile, neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. Meditate on words for modern times, alive to this surge, this minute, and the next, curving towards us to reveal poet on poet's calling. 3. Question. Is there a difference if you've heard this one before or 7 other people read the same poem, if ever it's the same? Which do you, he, she and I hear or want? We anticipate having written a little ourselves. Some just wait, expectorant but undecided, contemplating means to conjugate verbal icons. Others crouch beneath a great authority, namely, phonemes dipped in sounds to set against despair. Or from tough shards of ancestral history, especially post-colonial midnight happenings, marked by the magic of powerful afterbirth. Perhaps that nascent celebration in our heads, waiting for release, or buried because love, singing, died. Or a special CD, loading a line from Keats, knowing a drop of dew is but a world of dew. Then, semi-finally, that satisfactory equation, briefly great, formed as all-purpose burns into cool radiance, then soars up the throat of language as she commands symbol, sound, and image to open and shut doors. Another poem does its work and then dissolves into earth water, fire, air. 4. Impatient, the quiet starts to rustle and undo as rhyming fingers manage artifice and mood. Once more, she is sunlight by the pool. Once more. Recalled, revised, recaptured for this gathering, she quivers, takes a space in several memories, is transmuted into many distances. As we listen to the one we come to find. The glass hall empties, awaits another coming. But she never leaves, our soul's certainty. See her as you will, as you can, as you travel, or sit still.
You notice at the end of the poem, there's several dates that are given. Now there's a message in that as well. Tumbu was saying about this poem, a poem becomes more satisfactory to the poet with revision. The urge to revise is always there. It is a creative itch. In other words, the perfect poem is future tense. Well, that's what he says, right? Well, that's sort of a point that he's making. The continuing revisions contribute to the sense of what the poet calls neat incompletion. So it's continually revised because the poem is never really complete, just simply neat incompletion. And so in the poem, I noticed something, and that was that it seems to be that there's a motif, a theme, to use Hassan's word, of sort of perpetual ongoing activity. The poet's work is never done, right? That's the idea. But you'll notice that there's something here that's used, and that is ing verb forms. What are ing verb forms? What do they express? When you say someone's sleeping, it's ongoing, right? Speaking, it's ongoing. It's not the activity that is not done. Now notice, in the poem, standing, taking, waiting, pilgriming, trysting, bringing, curving, contemplating, waiting, loading, knowing, making. Remember what David Butt said about what Hassan meant by symbolic articulation? Mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, taking the way that we use language. We use verb ing forms to indicate ongoing activity and turning it into a non-habitual consistency. You turn it into a pattern. And what is it that is being conveyed by that pattern? That there's ongoing activity. It's not done. That's one motif. But there's another also device that is used here, and that is the conjunction as. And what does as express? And it's repeated. As we walked into ourselves, as her eyes watch 7 golden koi, as she commands, as it makes you, as. Repeated, right? What does as express? If you use the conjunction as, it expresses a kind of simultaneity. It's things happening at the same time. This is happening as this is happening. Okay? Now, again, it's taking the way that we use language, taking that conjunction as, turning it into something that is repeated throughout, more often than we're likely normally to use. It becomes an obvious pattern, and it expresses a particular motif. It expresses something, simultaneity. Now, there's a motif that's very clearly being expressed very explicitly in the poem. Tombu says this, that is never done, for our words don't take in all. The perfect poem is future tense. Meanwhile, neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. Not complete, not finished, not over. So we've had these three motifs: ongoing activity, things happening at the same time. It's never complete. All right, now, those were three motifs that seem to be quite pronounced. Okay, I'll say that, pronounced throughout this poem. Another thing I noticed is that there's a lot of pronouns that are used here. And remember, I like to take those participants, right? So who's mentioned? She, we, you. All right, so what do we notice about these? Is there any pattern that we see emerging here? Well, let me ask this question. When you have a pronoun, it's supposed to refer to someone, right? And so when he says she, does it go back to that? We have we and we have you. Well, that's pretty obvious, all right? We and you. But she, we're drawn to question. Who is she? Who is she? Well, let's just focus then on she for the time being. Well, we have three mentions that she is sunlight. She is again sunlight. She is sunlight. Okay, she is sunlight. I noticed something else about the use of she. Yes, it's repeated, she is sunlight. But wherever she is the grammatical subject, the verb that follows is always simple present tense. Not past, not future, only simple present. What does a simple present express? Timelessness. The present is timeless. So what is being expressed is a sense of sort of timelessness by she is. So let's add another motif to our list here. We've had ongoing activity, simultaneity, incompleteness, outright said, and timelessness, which again is pretty much outright said by the poet. He says it quite explicitly, with no beginning, no end, always darkness to elide, no end to the craft that makes the art, never done, a cup always slips, and even sort of his own word coinage, semi-finally, not finally, semi-finally, she never leaves, our sole certainty. Timelessness. So in this poem, there's quite a lot being packed in here. Something that is ongoing. Things that are happening at the same time. Never complete. Timeless. Remember what Mir said? The words of the poem are used in a symbolic way, having more than a single meaning. The effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way is to evoke a sense of reality that none of them possess alone. The nature of this reality is not precise. It is indefinite. There is this line in the poem. I don't know it. Another poem does its double work and then dissolves into earth, water, fire, air. The four elements: earth, water, fire, air. Did you notice how many sort of parts there were? And Tumbu, as he read the poem, one, and then gave that part of the poem, then two, and then three, four. Now, curiously, Gods Can Die, I analyzed it, was things in twos. David, things in threes. A poet reading, four. Yes, I do think Edwin was, in a way, playing with the numbers here. There does seem to be, in his poetry, generally, a kind of sort of emphasis on numerology, numbers. They're significant. But here, earth, water, fire, air, and you have four parts to the poem, right? So, my hypothesis is this. A poet reading is a poem in four parts. Each part highlighting one of the four elements, and in this sequence: fire, water, air, earth. You have four parts. And what I'm suggesting, that each of those parts, to each of those parts belongs one of these elements. In this sequence, the first part, fire. The second, water. The third, air. The fourth, earth. Now, you'll notice that in the poem there's a lot of allusions to other poets and poetry, right? You notice that there's the allusion to Keats, right? But in another respect, I think that what is also going on in this poem is, again, related to another poet's work, and that is T.S. Eliot's. And T.S. Eliot wrote 4 quartets. The 4 quartets, 4 constituent poems, 4 poems, and each of them corresponds to the 4 elements. In this order: fire, water, air, earth. And you see, the poem is basically an allusion to T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. What was there is sort of being modeled here in this poem. Let's take the first one. She is sunlight. So what does that convey to you? Think about the elements, all right? Well, most obviously, sunlight is associated with fire. This element in particular is associated with a kind of spiraling energy, all right, spiraling upwards. And it corresponds to a particular shape, the tetrahedron. Now, where do these associations come from? Like, how did I come up with the idea that the tetrahedron, which is sort of symbolic of this idea of spiraling energy, is related to fire? All right, where did that come from? It comes from Plato. Plato assigned the 4 elements to 4 shapes. The element of fire he assigned to the tetrahedron. Now, the tetrahedron has how many sides? 4 sides. Okay, 4 sides to the tetrahedron, to that shape. You can see it there, all right? There are four sides to it. Now, the first part here, she is sunlight. Well, that keeps repeating. There alone, all right, you already begin to feel that sense of association with fire, okay? But something else here. There are 4 sides to a tetrahedron, and there are 4 sentences in this first part. I've highlighted them in different colors here. 4 punctuated sentences, 4 sides. Something else I noticed, though, and that is if I look through the poem, I begin to see that, well, there are different things that are associated with these 4 elements, and you have sunlight is fire. And as you can imagine, a pool is water, garden is earth, and songs are air. There's sort of a tradition around the association between different things and the 4 elements. And so I looked through it and sort of noticed those associations. Tactile, feel, earth. The sky, air. Eyes, watch, fire. Swim, water. The heart, water. Lingering strands of bitter ancient winds. Sorry, it seems to be left out here. Air. Darkness. Earth. Sunlight. Fire. All right, so as I looked through it, what I began to see is there were like 3 paths through the 4 elements. Like they're repeated 3 times, but in a different order. So it got me thinking. If I follow these 4 paths and sort of drew a line to connect them, well, in the end, what do I end up with? Visually, a tetrahedron. This particular first part, well, it seemed pretty obvious. Fire, all right? All right, so I mean, let's look on, let's carry on. If these Platonic solids are associated with these 4 elements, and Tumbu is sort of playing with this concept and playing with this idea here, what about the others? All right, so what is curious, really curious, all right, as I went through this poem, 3 of the 4 stanzas, the number of sentences equals the number of faces of the Platonic solid corresponding to a particular element. Oh, we already saw sentence 1. How many sentences? 4 sentences. The tetrahedron, 4 sides. Fire. Skip stanza 2 for a moment. Stanza 3. 8 sentences. 8-faced octahedron. Air. Stanza 4. 6 sentences. The 6-faced cube. Earth. It's quite striking, right? 3 of the 4, the number of sentences in that part corresponds to, acceptedly corresponding to, the number of sides of the Platonic solid identified by Plato as being associated with a particular element. There's only one stands out. Stanza 2. It's the exception. But remember, the perfect poem is future tense. In other words, there will always be sort of a flaw left there that somehow doesn't fit the pattern. 3 here, yes, did. 1 stanza did not. Neat incompletion must suffice. That's what the poet is saying. Now, there's another side to this, another layer of meaning, of association. And it was there in T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets as well. Remember, there's a sequence: fire, water, air, earth. Well, there is a significance to the sequence. That same sequence of elements is the formula of what's called the tetragrammaton, corresponding to the 4 letters. So in other words, it's sort of the elements in that particular sequence projects a particular formula. And those 4 letters that are spelled out in the tetragrammaton are Y, H, W, H. What does that represent? If you're familiar with Hebrew at all, you would notice that it is the name of God. It also, though, refers to simply the process of creation. It is the I am who I am. Yahweh. In other words, what's being spelled out here is, you can either take it as God, Yahweh, or even really the process of creation itself. So what Tumbu is doing is he's employing visual representation, verbal representation, but what he's spelling out is that this is the process of creation. Remember, we asked the question, who is she? She is. What is Yahweh? I am. That's the question that we're being drawn to ask. Our reading of the poem, our reading of who she is never going to be complete. Instead, it extends recursively in multiple trajectories, multiple directions, as far as our knowledge of conceivable associations will allow. In other words, when you read that poem, if you didn't know anything about Plato's solids or T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets or Keats or whatever, would you be able to draw those associations? No. But you'll notice that it just goes on and on and on from one association to the next, and it just sort of extends sort of recursively in different directions. That's art, okay? That is art. That's when what you're looking at has way more meaning than you realized it when you looked at it at first. That the more you go into it, the more you discover. What there is a metaphor within a metaphor. There's so many layers of metaphor, symbols, metaphors. At the end of the poem, do you notice what Tumbu says? He says this: see her as you will. See her as you will. As you can. As you travel or sit still. See her. Read the poem. Understand the poem as you can. as you will. In other words, what makes it art is that there's more there to discover. And as you peel the layers away, you begin to see there's so much more going on there. That is really the art. Tumbu said this, he says, the poet's technique is what releases the poem into a form of immortality. I don't remember if I mentioned this the last time. When if I have, then sorry for me repeating it, but it goes with what is being said here very well. When I left Singapore, I taught a class, it was sociolinguistics, and the lectures were very large. Over 200 students were in the class. And there's a large lecture theater, and it was going to be my last class before I left Singapore to come to Hong Kong. And I asked Professor Edwin Tumbu if he would read one of his poems. And it's a poem I later analyzed. I haven't discussed it here and won't be. It's called Language as Power. And so I asked him to come to the lecture theater and for that last class of mine in Singapore and read the poem. And he agreed. So I went to his office and to escort him to the lecture theater. And I went there before, and we were walking to the lecture theater. And while we're walking, I said to him, because I wondered if the students would really grasp what the poem was about. So I said to him, I said, if you don't mind, can you, after you finish reading the poem, discuss how to interpret the poem? And he looked at me with a really stern face. It was good I was leaving, because he said to me, you never ask the poet to interpret his own poem. And I felt really, well, embarrassed. And I think I shrunk to, it was, but I have to admit that when he said that to me, I thought, so why not? You know, let us know what it's about, you know, fill us in, tell us, you know. That was going through my mind at the time. Yeah, okay. I understand now. I understand it. Because you see, what does a poem mean? Well, like the poet reading, it is however the person reading the poem interprets the poem, understands the poem. That is the meaning of the poem. It's not a poet writing, it's a poet reading. In the reading of the poem, that poem takes on a certain immortality. Why? Because every time it is read, it is again reinterpreted. It is again making meaning to whoever's doing the reading. But if the poet comes along and says, this is what the poem means, then it cannot mean anything else. It can only mean what the poet says it means. You've basically taken the life out of the poem. Because what is the poem? What gives it that sense of immortality is it continues to live as long as people reading it, read it, and from it, take away some meaning from the poem. That is it isn't just the art is in the poet's writing. It's in also the reading of the poem, where the life really is given. Because as you read the poem, you interpret the poem. Every time it continues to live, it continues to mean. Well, we're going to have to pause here. It's time to take a break. And before we go on, it's about 1:51. I see by my phone. It's when we come back, we're going to look at this poem, Uncle Never Knew. Now, this poem was interesting because I'll just say this before we take the break. What was interesting, he said to me, Tambu said, when you look at this poem, when you analyze this poem, nothing of what you were able to apply in previous poems will you be able to apply here. This poem is completely different. This poem goes back to his roots. He is mixed Chinese and Indian. And this poem goes back to his roots, and we'll talk more about it when we come back. Okay, so let's take the break, and when we come back. By the way, I did give you in the Canvas folder for this week a document, a Word document. You could print it out, and that Word document has the poems that we've been looking at. And I do feel it would be helpful if you printed it and looked at it. And something else which I won't be covering here, and that is that this poem in particular has been translated into Chinese. And so it'll be interesting perhaps to compare the Chinese with the English after we have looked at how it's interpreted. All right, so I have kept us till it's almost 5 to, let's say that we start again at 5 minutes past the hour, all right? 2:05, we'll start then. Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody, shall we begin again? And appreciate the comments on the chat. Like to see it when you guys respond in some way or make comments or ask questions. It's nice to be able to interact through that means. All right, get some ideas of how you see it in terms of what's being expressed. I don't think that what we see in terms of the poet's technique is clearly quite intentional, not coincidental. And the poet is drawing on experience of associations that will fall out of our own awareness. That's why he says, see her as you can, as you will, because it also depends on to what extent one pursues it, one looks for it. But that's why I see the point now very clearly why he says, don't ever ask the poet to interpret his own poem. Because it will be the poem itself and the poem's immortality itself, the art that's been created that will continue to mean. And the poet wants that to continue, wants it to mean perhaps other than what it meant to the poet. Okay, let's take a look at this poem. And this poem expresses, as I mentioned, he's part Chinese, part Indian. And he had an uncle that Edwin Tambu liked and spent time with, talking. And this poem is about his uncle, and it's entitled Uncle Never Knew. Now, again, I don't have him actually reading out this poem, so I'll read it as we go through it. He lived, if you could call it that, 2 streets off Boat Key North, tranquil as leaves left in a teacup. Always alone, but never lonely. The daily bustle of barge and coolie, ferrying rubber, rice, and spice, all energy and profit for Tokays and Guthries. Slip past without ripple or sound or promise. No enterprising cleverness to make his brothers happy, as nothing drew him to our hot meridian. Often after rain, he would watch the day dry out, but if a few fine drops caught the sun and glittered against that thinning blue strip of northern sky, he was back in Swatow, at his table, preparing ink and brush, fingering his father's piece of jade, intoning Li Po, Du Fu, and reading Mao. Sipped tea, fed his carps while watching for his friends. Great houses are history, clan, essential unity, belief. A way of life which brooks no breaking of fidelity. Rooted comforts reaffirm, nothing is extinguished. Memory is full and whole. He was ensconced, secure. For a few, it's the only pulse. Many need this bedrock, this island, so little that Cheng Ho barely noticed. Post-astral uncle stroked his undernourished beard, spoke to clouds, not people. The moon climbed roofs as he waited for glowworms to signify the darkening bamboos. Communing with self, he was his favorite neighbor. He could not hear migrant hearts change rivers, or from big to a small smelly one, or feel dreams gather along Carpenter Street, then roll down Tel Aryar up Angsong Hill to answer temple bells. The world was hard language, felt daily as heart and will drop into soft releasing opium, working up hungry lungs as shadows flickered on the wall. He never knew our age in full, had no transplanted way to name its joys, its follies. True exile, he denied our home till life do us part in 51, leaving companions Marx, Engels, Mao, Lu Xun, the Li Sao, Tao Qian. When I am Bayou River, I feel Uncle watching me. I hear much from inside his spirit, his affirmations. Old country stories resurface, tell their tale. That house I've never seen tries to sketch itself. Well, you've probably got some idea about his uncle, right? His uncle, brought from China to Singapore, expected to take part in the family business, but reluctant to do so. Didn't like the life in Singapore, wanted to be back in China. He was this true exile. His uncle did finally return to China, as mentioned in the poem, in 51. But what I want to look at this poem through and see is what was there that Tumbu was sort of incorporating into this poem. Because, I mean, I've seen his poems are so rich, right, in what the traditions and the associations that are made. Okay, so just take that first part. He lived, if you could call it that, 2 streets off Boat Key North. Tranquil as leaves left in a teacup. Always alone, but never lonely. The daily bustle of barge and coolie, ferrying rubber, rice, and spice, all energy and profit for Tokays and Guthries, slip past without ripple or sound or promise. The names obviously refer to places in Singapore. Now, there's a point to be made here, and that is, as he said to me, the associations will not be Western. So this opposition between uncle's tranquil, solitary existence and the daily bustle of life around him, well, that's rather reminiscent of a similar opposition that is found in the first two lines of Tao Qian's famous fifth poem, Drinking Wine. In those two lines from Tao Qian's poem, I built my house in this world of men, but there's no noise of carriages and horses. And so there's this opposition between uncle's sort of very tranquil, solitary existence and what's going on around him. Professor Zhang Longxi, also here at City U, he comments this about Tao Qian's poetry. He says, the first two lines of this poem set up a structural and thematic opposition between the poet's private world and the world of men, with its noise of carriages and horses, an opposition that reappears time and again in Tao Qian's poetry. And Tumbu's drawing on this as well. He's also creating this thematic opposition, very reminiscent of what Tao Qian was doing between the private world, his uncle, and the world of men. Uncle is this true exile, and he, as I said, he stubbornly resisted attempts to bring him into the family business. Notice what it says, no enterprising cleverness to make his brothers happy, as nothing drew him to our hot meridian. He didn't want to take part in the family business at all. He longed for the life that he previously knew back in Swatow, in China. Again, the poet's description of his uncle recalls descriptions of Tao Qian. Zhang Longxi says this, there was a certain stubbornness and a great deal of courage in Tao Qian that made him a solitary traveler on the path he chose. All right, so take a look at the other lines. Often after rain, he would watch the day dry out. But if a few fine drops caught the sun and glittered against that thinning blue strip of northern sky, he was back in Swatow. At his table. Now notice what I've highlighted in yellow here is he's back in Swatow. What a contrast here. Here in Singapore, he's watching the day dry out. All right, doing nothing. But back in Swatow at his table, preparing ink and brush, fingering his father's piece of jade, intoning Li Po, Du Fu, and reading Mao, sipped tea, fed his carps while waiting for his friends. Active. Now, he mentions two poets here, Du Fu, the poetry of Du Fu, and as I mentioned at the bottom here, the poet historian was said to reflect the Confucianist way. But the free spirit of Li Bai or Li Po, one of the 8 immortals of the wine cup, suggests a more Taoist influence. So there's the two influences that are there, one Confucianist, the other Taoist, and reading Mao. He never knew our age in full, had no transplanted way to name its joys, its follies. True exile, he denied our home till life do us part in 51, leaving companions, Marx, Engels, Mao, Lu Xun, Li Sao, Tao Qian. And again, there's a balance here. Where we just saw a Confucianist and Taoist here. Again, there's sort of a balance between the revolution and tradition. The forces of radical change, Marx, Engels, Mao. And then the foundations of China's cultural heritage, Lu Xun, Li Sao, Tao Qian. Again, there's sort of both sides. Now, there's a very interesting sort of association here that I'm going to mention. And it becomes apparent in that line 22 where Edwin writes post-astral. Now, that I wasn't aware of what astral meant until I saw that, and I looked it up and to discover what was he talking about. Well, astral suggests something like of an out-of-the-body experience. Well, that was sort of Uncle's back in Swatow experience. When he was back in Swatow and thinking about back in the life that he had there, sort of transported on a silver cord. What was the silver cord? Those few fine drops glittering in the sunlight against that thinning blue strip of northern sky. He was back in Swatow. And then, but line 22, post-astral Uncle. So he's back, all right? He was there, back in Swatow, in his mind, all right? In that sort of out-of-the-body experience. In line 22, back to reality, post-astral. Now, there's a very interesting use of numbers here. The first 11 lines of the poem, lines 1 through 11, notice that they describe what we could call pre-astral Uncle. Pre-astral. That is before his back in Swatow experience, all right? His astral back in Swatow experience, well, that's from lines 12 to 21. So up through 11, pre-astral. Up through 21, astral like back in Swatow. Now, 11 lines later, line 22, he's become post-astral Uncle. Post-astral then from line 22 on to line 31, changing again 11 lines later in line 32. In line 32, the tense shifts mid-sentence. All along it's been past tense, and now finite verbs since line 22. Now let me read that more clearly. Again, 11 lines later in line 32, the tense shifts mid-sentence from past tense, which characterized all finite verbs since line 22, to the present tense form of the finite verb drop. His heart and will drop into soft releasing opium, working up hungry lungs. Let me illustrate it here. It's easier. All right, so he lived, if you could call it that, 2 streets off. That's line 1. Up through line 11, against that thinning blue strip of northern sky. And line 12, he was back in Swatow. Okay, so astral Uncle begins from line 12 up through line 21. Post-astral Uncle, beginning at line 22, ends in line 31. Line 32, all it's been since line 22 been past tense. Suddenly the tense shifts. That's the point I'm making. The tense shifts now to present tense. And that is lines 32 through 41. Okay, so we see it seems to break down into the 4 parts, right? 1 through 11, pre-astral. 12 through 21, astral. Post-astral, ending on line 31. Restoration, his return, all right? Present tense, line 41. All seems to, there is a pattern there. 11, 21, 31, 41. Now, when did Uncle return? Remember? 51. You see there's a pattern emerging here. 11 pre-astral, up to 21 astral, up to 31 post-astral Uncle. His return to China up through 41. When did he return? 51. There's something going on here. Let's continue to take a look. Now, first of all, when I read this section here, I notice something quite striking. He never knew our age in full, had no transplanted way. 11 words. If I go down, all of these lines all have 11 words in each line. Is there something curious about the number 11? All right, so go back and go to take a look in sort of tradition, Asian, Eastern tradition. Does the number 11 have any significance? Well, if one goes back to look in the I Ching, 64 hexagrams included in the I Ching. You see an example there, hexagram 11, associated with peace, tranquility. It's made up of sort of two trigrams, one representing earth and the other heaven below. So the number 11 does have sort of a significance. But you notice for the poet's uncle, it was not death that parted them, but life. Till life do us part in 51. When he left to go back to China, he left in 1951. Before his return, remember how the poem begins, it was open to question whether he lived or only existed. He lived, the poem says, if you could call it that. But life is now recovered as he returns to his origins. Till life do us part. Interestingly, from hexagram 11 in the I Ching, there's a description. It says this, bearing with the uncultured in gentleness, fording the river with resolution, not neglecting what is distant, not regarding one's companions. Notice, till life do us part in 51, leaving companions. Again, it seems to be alluding back to the I Ching, back to this particular hexagram 11. Now, on the one hand, when we look at the I Ching and so forth, there's always this representation of yin and yang, right? They're opposites, but they're also supposed to be complementary to each other. There's a balance that is achieved between them. And the associations are very often yin is feminine, yang is masculine. Yin is dark, yang is light. Yin represents movement down and in. Yang represents movement out and up. Now notice, he could not hear migrant hearts change rivers, from big to a small smelly one, or feel dreams gather along Carpenter Street, then roll down Teluk Ayer, up Aung San Hill to answer temple bells. The world was hard language, felt daily as heart and will drop into soft releasing opium, working up hungry lungs as shadows flickered on the wall. Talking about change. And twice there's sort of a mention of movement. It begins down and up. And the antonyms are big and small, hard and soft. And twice the poet refers to the noun heart, migrant hearts, heart and will. The verb to feel, again, is repeated twice. Feel dreams, felt daily. Again, we see this repetition of sort of pairs, barge and coolie, energy and profit, Tokays and Guthries. You see the alliteration, leaves left, bustle, barge, rubber, rice, rice, spice, ink and brush, lipo and tofu, sip tea, fed his carps. There's sort of, again, that duality is coming through here. There is that, like we saw in Gods Can Die, yin represents emptiness and nothingness. In the first stanza, Uncle's yin side is evident. The very beginning, no enterprising cleverness to make his brothers happy. Happy as nothing drew him to our hot meridian. Pre-astral, Uncle is described as always alone but never lonely. Tranquil as leaves left in a teacup. All energy and profit slip past without ripple or sound or promise. He's alone, but he's not lonely. The teacup is empty except for the tea leaves left behind. All energy and profit leave nothing behind in their wake. Yin, emptiness, nothingness. Yang, though, is movement, it's energy. It's that counterpart to pre-astral uncle. It is his yang self back in Swatow. He's preparing, fingering, intoning, reading, waiting. He's surrounded by all that reminds him of a way of life which brooks no breaking of fidelity, in which rooted comforts reaffirm. Nothing is extinguished. As the poem concludes in the last 4 lines, in the first 2 lines, the first person pronoun, I, is the repeated grammatical subject in the 3 clauses. You can see I am, I feel, I hear. Uncle's presence is sensed. His affirmations are heard, but it's very spiritual, not physical. Again, the Tao is likened by some to a path, a river. And at the end of it, one achieves this sort of return to origins. And at the point of origin, there's balance, there's harmony, there's tranquility. You see, the uncle is longing for a return to his origin, where there will be balance, where there will be harmony, where there will be tranquility. It's back in China, back in Swatow. The last 2 lines are quite interesting. Old country stories. And notice how it's uppercase, country. And that house, again, uppercase. And they're both very actively trying to give information about themselves. Old country stories resurface, tell their tale. That's verbal, right? That house I've never seen tries to sketch itself, visual. There's a very much of a creative energy that's at work. This reference to resurface suggests this energy is moving upward. Both are features of yang. So when did Uncle return to Swatow? Remember, it's 51. Uncle never knew it ends on line 41. And it ends with that sentence, that house I've never seen tries to sketch itself. The poet, Edwin, he never saw that house. He only heard what his uncle told him about it. So that house, he's never seen it. It tries to sketch itself. It tries to visualize. He tries to visualize what it is his uncle was telling him about. And so it's unfinished, tries to sketch itself. He never can really fully understand and appreciate what his uncle was feeling about what life was like back in Swatow. You see, it's almost like there is a part that's missing. Lines left unwritten, which would take us up to 51, when his uncle returned. Lines 42 through 51. It's almost like there's a part here that the poet wished to write, but couldn't, because that house he'd never seen, it only tries to sketch itself. It's almost like that part is something that he wished he could write. And it was true. On the many visits that Edwin made to Hong Kong, he always wanted to go, but never was able to, back to that place where his uncle was from, back to Swatow. It's he always hoped to go back there. And it's almost like these lines that the space that is here, where you lines 1 through 11, lines 12 through 21, lines 22 through 31, line 32 through 41, and then lines 42 through 51 would have been completing. He would actually see what it was. He would know what it is that his uncle was talking about. It wasn't just uncle never knew. Edwin never knew. So the illusions there are, and the number 11, yes, does seem to have some bearing on it. And the yin and yang duality also, it seems to be something that Tumbu is playing with in this poem. He's bringing in all these various aspects to it. As the poet says, neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. And that's sort of the feeling that one gets from reading this particular poem. And when the poem is translated into Chinese, one wonders whether those various aspects, like the shifts in tense, how would they be captured? Would they be captured? So much of a poem, because when the translation takes place, very often the translation is dealing with that verbalization, right? And to what extent is that able in the translation of that verbalization to get across those various meanings that are being conveyed through the symbolic articulation, through the use of background and foreground and so forth? Or how much is, as the phrase goes, lost in translation? Well, what I think I'll be ending today on is a little bit of inspiration. And the inspiration is going to come from, well, not a poem, but a speech. And it's Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream." When we look at language and art, this is art as well.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down In Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. A dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Obvious as one looks at this and listens to this. I mean, it is the repetition that comes through here. The rhythm that is created through that repetition. He is repeating, of course, the idea of this idea of a dream. He repeats it, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. It continues. That repetition, that pattern, all right, continues throughout. You continue, it carries us forward throughout in this text. When it comes to the end, I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Here he is quoting from the Bible. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain. The crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all the flesh will see it together. With this hope, our hope, he says, this is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. With this faith, we will, again, with this faith, we will, repeating 3 times, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, repeating. The phrases repeat, and as he repeats it, you feel the power and the dynamic that comes through the presentation of what he's saying. Now, it doesn't just come across in great speeches, in poetry. It also comes through even in a movie. A movie that you might think, okay, that's entertainment. And it is entertainment. But there is very often perhaps a kind of meaning. Of course, it depends on the writer and the director and the actors and so forth. But go back to this book, Agatha Christie. Now, I don't know if any of you have read her murder mysteries. There are a number of them. This one, Murder on the Orient Express, it was written in 1934. Now, on one level, you just say that this is a novel that's a crime novel in which almost formulaically there is a murder, and then this great investigator, Hercule Poirot, comes along and he solves the murder in the last scene. Okay? But beyond it, it's also been described as an astonishing exploration of justice. What is justice? Now, there have been 3 film adaptations that are well known. One goes back and it's regarded as the classic. It's the 1974 film starring Albert Finney. There's also been a television series regarding the Hercule Poirot, and this stars David Suchet. And in 2010, Christmas Day, they televised this version of Murder on the Orient Express. And then more recently, 2017, Kenneth Branagh's Murder on the Orient Express, and starring Kenneth Branagh and directed by Kenneth Branagh. Now, what's the movie? What's it about? Well, in the closing scene, the famous detective Hercule Poirot, he announces the solution to the mystery. Who murdered one of the passengers on this train? The Orient Express is a train, and one of the passengers has been murdered. But we soon discover that the person who was murdered on the train was himself a murderer. In fact, quite a despicable one. He had abducted, he had kidnapped a small child, a young girl, and had murdered her. And he was never brought to justice. Now, this is what transpires in the movie, in the book. Spoiler alert, the 12 other passengers who happened to be on this train all happen to be related somehow to the family of that murdered child. As it turns out, and here's the spoiler, they conspired together to kill this criminal. This criminal who the justice system failed to convict. This guy who got away with murder. They conspired together to kill him. Now, in both the 1974 version and the novel, at the very end, when it's revealed that these 12 conspired together to kill this despicable murder guy who had become now a rich businessman and was on this train, well, Poirot accepts the 12 as almost like being a jury. He agrees to cover up the crime. And he says that the killer must have, well, there's sort of, this is the story, that some guy got on the train and then escaped the train having murdered this guy. This was the story that was going to be told to the police. This is from the book, all right? And we'll end shortly. So I just wanted to, we'll get into the rest of it in the next lesson, but let me conclude this because I wanted to show how the 1974 version is very similar to how the book ends. And the book ends like this. Poirot looked at his friend. You are a director of the company, Monsieur Bouc. He said, what do you say? Monsieur Bouc cleared his throat. In my opinion, Monsieur Poirot, he said, the first theory you put forward was the correct one. Decidedly so. I suggest that it is the solution we offer to the Yugoslavian police when they arrive. You agree, doctor? Certainly I agree, said Dr. Constantine. As regards the medical evidence, I think that I made one or two fantastic suggestions. Then, said Poirot, having placed my solution before you, I have the honor to retire from the case. So it is, as you saw in the movie, by the way, they had become stranded on this mountain and could not get through because of a sort of a snow avalanche. And so there's sort of this breakthrough, as you saw pictured, all right? The train is able to break through and everyone is on their way and everyone is happy. Well, that is quite, what is that saying? And it's very different than what we will see when we look at the subsequent movies. We'll look at the other version, 2010 version. We'll look at the 2017 version. What I'm going to be talking about is the fact that when we look at especially the 2017 version, Kenneth Branagh's, the language itself conveys a very clear sort of message as far as what is justice. What is justice? And so we'll come back, and we're to the end of the hour, and so we'll stop there, hold these thoughts, and we'll come back to it again next week. All right, see you next week.